So Dr. Moazzam has already given you a brief background, but I think I'm just going to set the tone of these sessions by thinking about, okay, what are we going to do for the next 3 hours or so? So our three speakers will actually be speaking about different dimensions of human morality. They will ponder upon questions that have actually perplexed humankind for centuries, and they'll try to hopefully simplify it for us. So where does human morality come from? Is it divine? Is it learned through environment? And how does one live an ethical life? And is it possible to live a completely ethical life? And how does one confront life's wicked problem of living with uncertainty? So this will be done using different philosophers or polymaths, as Dr. Moazzam has already introduced, people who have knowledge from different sources. First, I'd like to ask Dr. Paul Lombardo to come to the stage. Just after a brief background, for those of you who came here yesterday, Dr. Lombardo was here for CBEC's inaugural 20 years ago. He has been through the CBEC's 2-decade journey, and he has been a constant support, and personally for me, he has been my mentor in many ways, and he was my teacher when I was doing my master's. And he has provided me a lot of support as far as my teaching is concerned, giving me feedback after my sessions. So I'm very grateful for that. He will be talking about Ibn-e-Sina, whom we, I think, know more as Avicenna, which is like really tells us a lot about how our education is conceptualized. And he's a famous Muslim philosopher and physician. But Dr. Lombardo, a very formal introduction to him. He is a Regents Professor and Professor of Law at the Center for Law, Health and Society, Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, USA. And Dr. Lombardo has also been the faculty for the course Law and Bioethics in CBEC's PhD program since its inception in 2006. And in 2023, he was named Distinguished Professor of Bioethics and Law at the Sindh Institute of Medical Sciences, which is the educational arm of SIUT. And another important part that Dr. Lombardo has played is that from 2011 to 2016, he was a senior advisor to the US Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. He has worked extensively in the area of eugenics movement that happened in the United States. He has a PhD and JD degree from the University of Virginia. So Dr. Lombardo, if you'd like to come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. When people say things like that, I'm always reminded of my grandmother. My grandmother lived to be 96 years old. And when she turned 90, of course, we had a party for her. And we asked all the great-grandchildren to say something about her. And they went around the table and they all said something nice. And when they were through, she looked up and we said, well, what would you like to say, Grandma? It's your birthday. And she said, well, I'm pinching myself. And so why are you pinching yourself? She said, I want to make sure that I'm still here because anytime I go somewhere and I hear that many nice things about someone, I think I'm at a funeral. So I've already pinched myself and I know I'm not at a funeral. So I hope when I'm through, you won't feel the same way. It is a time for me to thank everyone here, certainly, particularly for this opportunity to come back to Karachi to celebrate CBEC. I was very happy to be here 20 years ago to see it born, and now this is a great return. Over that same time span, my own travels to Karachi, I've actually made the slides go forward now. I'm going to make them go backwards. One of the few good things about getting older now, actually this one. Okay, I'll back. Okay, the other way. Okay. One of the few things about getting older is you can always complain that you don't understand the technology. Coming back and forth to Karachi, this is my 10th trip. I have been the beneficiary of insights that I would not really have expected. And my comments today are one example of that. And so I'm going to digress just a little bit more to explain. A few years ago, I was returning home to the United States. I was supposed to go through New York. There was a snowstorm, and they closed the airport, and so I had to stop in Istanbul, and I stayed there for a day. And I found myself with time to kill. I was wandering around the airport there, usually very much in a hurry, but I had some leisure then, and so I noticed travel posters from all kinds of places, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, and was surprised in my ignorance of geography that many of these places seemed a very reasonable distance to fly to. I was particularly drawn to a travel poster showing trips to Tashkent and Samarkand and other cities in Uzbekistan, and I wondered whether I might actually be able to make a trip like that sometime. So several years later, I was fortunate to convince a good old friend of mine to come with me on a trip, and we learned a great deal about a place that I'd only heard about as a student, and it was a place that provided very important connections in my own understanding of the spread of Muslim culture in Central Asia during a period which in the West is known as the early Middle Ages, or even worse, the period that much of the European world has called the Dark Ages, which stretched from the fall of Rome in the late 5th century to a time at least 500, sometimes almost 1,000 years later, when Roman and Grecian cultural artifacts and literature were recovered, in some cases as late as the 15th century. So while these historians mark the 13th and 14th century as the end of those so-called Dark Ages, they could be said to have ended much, much earlier in places like Baghdad or parts of the Muslim world, even as early as the 8th century, because that is when linguistic scholars in Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Central Asia began translating a large part of the literature from ancient Greece into Arabic. And so when I was asked to say a few words at this event, I decided to engage with a topic that I've thought about in my 20 years of traveling back and forth to Pakistan, and that is the debt that people all around the world have to thinkers and scholars who laid the foundations of science and medicine that we know today. It's common for many to credit such developments to the period in the West known as the Enlightenment, a time from the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe that gave birth to a number of fascinating intellectual revolutions, a number of violent revolutions as well. But the ideas relied upon by people who are often credited with generating modern science rested on foundations that were much older. And some of the most important of those ideas can be traced to Muslim physicians and scholars. We know how important those people were to the period known as the Renaissance because famous painters like Raphael included them in the majestic works like the School of Athens, a fresco in the Vatican in Rome, which celebrates some of the great thinkers. And if you hone in on this painting, you see, for example, the work of Ibn Rushd, or a person known in the West as Averroes, a physician and philosopher born in Cordoba in the 12th century. He is shown in the picture looking over the shoulder of Pythagoras, who was talking to another Greek, Archimedes, and all of these are pictured alongside ancient greats like Socrates and Ptolemy, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander the Great. Averroes was known for his extensive commentaries on Aristotle, many of which were later translated eventually into Latin and Hebrew. And the translations of his work reawakened Western interest in Aristotle and other Greek thinkers that led many of those who were known as the humanists to re-examine the scholars of the ancient world that were preserved and recorded and translated and reintroduced to Europe by Muslim thinkers like Ibn Rushd. But his work relied on efforts that occurred even centuries earlier, and it points towards the subject of my comments today. One of the people whose birthplace I was able to visit on that journey to Uzbekistan was a man known to the Latin-speaking world as Avicenna. I knew his name, I knew that part of his name at least, from studies in the history of medicine, but until my trip I did not really realize that he was born in Bukhara, near Bukhara, and his name was Ibn-e-Sina, and he had an extraordinary influence on the practice of medicine for more than 500 years. He was able to build on the foundations of ancient learning that by this time had been translated into Arabic, So what I would like to do today is explain why he remains a person whose story is worth retelling. This is a photo of the Ark of Bukhara, it's a massive fortress in that city, initially built and occupied around the 5th century. Some version of the Ark would have been standing when Ibn-e-Sina was born. And he was born in the year 980 in the village of Afshana near the city of Bukhara. And today we see famous monuments like this minaret, which was built in the 12th century, and literally dozens of madrasas all around Bukhara, and for that matter, all around Uzbekistan. And of course, we see these walls built in the 16th century that are the signature motif of that city. But before we had all of that architectural glory, we had Ibn-e-Sina. His father was a civil servant in Bukhara when he was young. His parents recognized his talents very early and arranged the best teachers to instruct him. He originally spoke a version of Persian, but then he learned Arabic and set about systematic study of a myriad of subjects. By any measure, he was a polymath of extraordinary and diverse talents. He was said to have read and, in fact, memorized the entire Quran as a boy. He also studied the Sharia and Islamic jurisprudence. He also studied civil law for about 2 years, and he used his knowledge of those topics to serve as an advisor to the prime minister. He was the grand vizier more than once. Here is a map showing some of the places where he traveled from Uzbekistan, with likely stops in parts of the world that are now known as Afghanistan, on to western Iran, where he lived his final years. He apparently did not reach this far east, but this map shows travel there by some of his contemporaries. Ibn-e-Sina began his medical career by studying the ancient Greek physician Galen, who was really the starting point for all medical studies of that time. This course of study began at age 13. He was reported to have been treating patients by the age of 16, and that was the same year that he began practicing law. By 18, he had already developed a reputation as a physician, and according to one account, in that year he was consulted by royal physicians for an ailment that the ruler of Bukhara had experienced, and his advice was so useful that he was allowed to access the royal library. This experience became the basis for much of his later writing on medicine that relied on ancient texts, like Galen, for example, for reference. Before long, his reputation as an expert in medicine was so widespread that later he was often compared to and grouped with Galen and even the Greek Hippocrates as the intellectual descendant who carried on the traditions of those ancient masters. And here's a woodcut from the Renaissance showing Ibn-e-Sina sitting between Galen and the Greek master of medicine, Hippocrates. Aristotle's writings were to form the basis for much of Ibn-e-Sina's work, particularly in the area of philosophy, but also by reference to the technique of argument he used and his focus on empirical observation and facts rather than expansive and abstract ideas. One of Ibn-e-Sina's first efforts as a writer, echoing a work by Aristotle, was called a Compendium on the Soul. A second major work was named The Compilation, and it included sections on physics, metaphysics, and theology. And this also was completed while he was still a teenager. By the age of 40, Ibn-e-Sina was a competent scholar and a writer in at least 8 different fields: law, finance, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, cosmology, logic, and metaphysics. He then decided to write a kind of encyclopedia of medicine, which he called the Canon of Medicine. And that book, in several modern translations, runs more than 2,500 pages. And in the last 30 years of the 15th century, it passed through at least 15 Latin editions and one in Hebrew. It eventually became one of the most influential medical works in the world. The book incorporated the prevailing theories of the 4 humors, the blood, the phlegm, the yellow bile, and the black bile, which were thought to be the basis for disease and illness. And relying on his self-taught Aristotelian patterns of logic and syllogism, Ibn-e-Sina developed a synthetic text that married what could be called universal theories of illness with universal examples of rules that should govern treatment. This systematic description of much that was known about clinical presentation of patients with suggestions for addressing various conditions made the canon useful in ways that earlier texts had not been. Despite what has been learned about bodily functions and the etiology of disease since then, at the time this was seen as an accessible compendium that far exceeded the work that had come before, and it also included a complete formulary of drugs at the time, which itself was an extraordinary and exceptional contribution to knowledge. Now, this image shows you on the left a manuscript version of the complete canon in 5 parts, a copy that was made near the end of the 16th century. It is in the Yale Medical Library in the United States. On the right is a Latin version of the same book printed in Venice at about the same time as the Arabic copy, and it resides at the University of Bologna Library. This image of from the canon comes from the 14th century, and it has illustrations of human anatomy. In the book, Ibn-e-Sina correctly documented the anatomy of the eye, along with descriptions of ophthalmic conditions such as cataracts. He stated that tuberculosis was contagious. He described the symptoms of diabetes and gave descriptions also of various types of facial paralysis. He also noted several psychiatric disorders, including the so-called disorder of love, which he considered an obsessive disorder resembling severe depression. Must not have been a good day for him. The book of the Canon of Medicine was composed over several decades and filled 5 volumes. The first volume is a compendium of medical principle. The second is a reference for individual drugs. The third contains organ-specific diseases. The fourth discusses systemic illnesses, as well as a section of preventive health measures. And the fifth contains description of compound medicines. There are entire chapters devoted to exercise, preventive medicine, and even travel medicine, something we could all use today. The work was both comprehensive and foresightful. 8 chapters in the book dealt with the functional neuroanatomy of the spine, including the structure of the vertebrae and various parts of the vertebral column and its biomechanics, illustrated here. Other authors wrote about Ibn-Sina's contributions to perinatal medicine, including whether or not to bind infants, where they should sleep, how they should be bathed and fed, as well as sections on the causes of deformity and anomalies. And if that weren't enough, he's also considered the father of modern plant biology and pharmacology. The canon was translated into Latin, as I said, towards the end of the 12th century by a man named Gerard of Cremona in northern Italy, and it became a reference source for medical studies in the universities of Europe until the end of the 17th century. Now, there's a detail in here that some of the nephrologists and others at SIUT may appreciate. According to one scholar, most of the diseases of the kidney and bladder can be recognized in the systemic classification of renal diseases and the accounts of bladder diseases given by Ibn-Sina in the canon. He was also the first to point out the fact that hematuria, blood in the urine, may be due to causes outside of the urinary system, for example, various blood diseases. And apart from this methodological classification and precise descriptions of causal factors and signs in this chapter on urinary disturbances, Ibn-Sina pointed out the role of psychological factors in the treatment of certain conditions, such as bedwetting. He warned against catheterization when there was inflammation because it was painful and caused swelling, and he himself developed a new kind of catheter to avoid those problems. This is an image of a commentary on, as it says in Latin, Avicenna, and this was commissioned by an Italian physician in around 1315 in Padua in northern Italy. It is one of the many copies of Ibn-Sina's book that circulated around Europe and were used in medical education. The physician who commissioned this work had it printed in Padua and then sent to Germany, where they did the illustrations and the illuminations as shown here. It is interesting to note that the person who used this book the most, the person who recognized himself as a scholar of the classics, a humanist, as he said, made detailed notes in the margin. He autographed those on the flyleaves, and he also wrote a series of glossary notes in triangular text blocks on many, many pages. And so this was a book that was very much used, besides being extraordinarily valuable just because of its craftsmanship. Another a book shown here is an analysis of that was only one book of his canon in Latin, printed in Venice in about 1640. Ibn-e-Sina is credited with writing an early treatise on psychiatry entitled Cures of the Heart. It focuses one section on emotional disorders and mental illnesses, and it grew out of an experience by Ibn-e-Sina in the Persian court of Hamadan, now in western Iran. He was contacted by a woman who was the mother of, and therefore the guardian and the regent for, the young man who was the ruler at the time. They had apparently sustained some military losses, and the boy became severely depressed and even delusional. And he believed that he was a cow, and he felt that he should be slaughtered so that his people could eat. Ibn-e-Sina was brought to diagnose what was going on, and he called the royal butcher. He said that the boy should be tied with ropes as if he were being prepared for the slaughter. And then as the butcher entered the court, of course, he'd been prepared for this, he went up and looked at the young man and said, "No, he's too thin. We couldn't make a single meal out of him until he's fattened up. He needs to eat better." And so the boy then began a different diet, began to eat properly, and he recovered from his delusions. And as a reward for this solution, Ibn-e-Sina was named as a court physician. And this episode was just one of the times that his successful treatment of someone in a ruler's position led to spots for him in court, not only as a physician, but as a minister who advised on matters of state. During this part of his life, he simultaneously acted as a scholar, a practitioner of medicine, a philosopher of science, a government official, and on the side, he took some advanced students. His extensive and diverse talents would have made him a Renaissance man centuries before that descriptor was coined by Europeans. Another book that Ibn-e-Sina completed in his later years was focused on treatments of a different kind. This book shown here was called The Cure, but was essentially a philosophical treatise designed not for bodily cure, but to cure the soul. It sets out a cure for ignorance, which he thought was an illness that provided burdens to the soul. His philosophical views have engaged the attention of Western thinkers over several centuries. His books have been among the most important sources in philosophy, and he is said by one scholar to have created a single, integrated, and comprehensive intellectual framework that encompassed philosophy, science, medicine, and religion. One serious scholar even called him the founder of scholastic philosophy. Now, as a person who grew up being taught by people who were scholars of scholastic philosophy, I found this to be an extraordinary claim because it puts him in the company of some of the great minds of the medieval world, and it reminds us that scholars of the three Abrahamic religions share a style of study and a style of disputation and discussion that borrows some of its technique from the thought of Aristotle. And that way of thinking held sway for almost 600 years as the Muslim world spread from its Middle Eastern origins through Europe and other parts of the world. And here we have three of those great thinkers. One theologian locates Ibn-e-Sina alongside Aquinas and Maimonides as major contributors to the intellectual study of religion and moral philosophy. But as you can see here, Ibn-e-Sina actually precedes Aquinas on the far right and Maimonides there in Cordoba in the middle. He wrote about philosophical concepts like essence and existence long before they did. So we are again reminded that the West gets its foundational texts from the ancient world, particularly Greece and Rome, via the Muslim world, whose commentaries predated people like Aquinas by centuries. In fact, when he prepared to write his own summary of theology, the Summa Theologica, in Paris in 1265, Thomas Aquinas also looked to Aristotle for structures of reason and taxonomy of ideas. And he was the preeminent Christian scholar of the medieval world, but he relied upon Ibn-e-Sina in writing the Summa. Not only did he read Ibn-e-Sina in a Latin translation, but Aquinas signals his debt to him by citing him no fewer than 10 times. As the medical schools of what would become the great European universities developed in cities like Padua or Bologna or Sorrento, or in France at Paris and Montpellier, Latin translations of Ibn-Sina became the key points for systematic teaching. But Ibn-Sina was so well known that he makes his appearance in what we might call popular culture as well. For example, in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, Ibn-Sina is named among the virtuous non-Christians who are mentioned in the text, along with people like Plato and Socrates and Virgil and Homer. And a century later, Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales has a reference to Ibn-Sina in his prologue as a discussion of one of his characters, the Doctor of Physic. And then finally, poet, astronomer, and mathematician Omar Khayyam eventually translates one of Ibn-Sina's treatises into Persian. The canon of medicine, called the single most enduring work in the history of medicine, as I've already noted, provided the basis for medical education in India, Europe, and the Middle East for centuries. We have found something like 400 individual works attributed to Ibn-Sina, archives as far-flung as the Bodleian Library of Oxford, the Topkapi of Istanbul, the National Archives in both Tehran and Cairo house his works, as does the Library of Congress and many universities in the United States and the Vatican Museum in Rome. Ibn Sina and the scholars of his world focused attention on the wisdom that originated with the Greeks and subjected it to critique and explication 4 or 5 centuries before the so-called High Renaissance in Europe that is often credited with recovering classical learning. His involvement with rulers and matters of state meant that as his patrons' fortunes declined, he sometimes had to move quickly and was motivated to go to places that were more welcoming. So he left Bukhara, eventually moved to Hamadan, and then he had to leave his position as vizier in Hamadan for Isfahan around 1020. There he eventually completed his life work in the canon of medicine, for which he became so famous. In his final years, he served the emir in Isfahan, and he died there at age 57 and was buried, and a monument was erected near his grave. And yet, scholars are still writing about the various prescriptions for good health that can be traced to him. Here's an article from 2020 in the European Heart Journal describing a heart-healthy Avicennan diet for the prevention of heart disease. If you travel to Bukhara, you can visit this museum, which stands near his birthplace. And in it, there are copies of his books and artifacts that demonstrate how advanced his ideas of medicine and science were at the time. Some of the medical and surgical instruments that were used in his day are also displayed there. Along with the tools used in experimentation, and experimentation is something that Ibn Sina wrote about in detail. In one chapter of the Canon of Medicine, he describes 7 conditions for the recognition of the strengths of the characteristics of medicines through experimentation. The principles presented in this treatise are similar to concepts that define the modern clinical trial. The 7 conditions are ensuring the use of pure drugs, testing the drug for only one disease, the use of control groups, the use of requirement of long-term observation, the use of dose escalation, the requirement of reproducible results, and a requirement that we use both animal and human testing. Now, one scholar says Ibn Sina clearly stresses the purity and proper storage of drugs, implying that the lack of an observed effect could be due to these factors. He gives clear consideration to the confounding factors in the design of an experiment and says the drug must only be tested for one condition because if the patient has more than one and each is in need of a different treatment, the treatments may conflict. And if the patient recovers, we are left uncertain as to which of the condition the drug was useful for. He also says that the strength of the drug must be proportionate to the severity of the disease, and in these instances it is better to test the drugs in low quantities and then increase the quantities to determine the effect and prevent unnecessary risk to the patient. This description of a control group is perhaps the earliest known example of a concept associated with modern clinical trials. Now, as I conclude, let me confess that I'm certainly not a scholar of Ibn-e-Sina, so of course I've had to rely on specialists who have studied him in detail. And among my other limitations, I don't read Arabic or any of the other languages used by scholars in this regard. So I've had to study books and articles in English, and I'm going to show you some of those because I think they are a wonderful resource. One is from a Saudi medical journal, another on some of the philosophical foundations of Ibn Sina's thought by Professor Gutas, who studies and teaches classical Arabic and the pre-modern intellectual tradition in Islamic civilization. I'm also indebted to this article in the Annals of Internal Medicine for insights about clinical trials. And one very recent text I consulted extensively is called The Genius of Their Age, Ibn Sina, Biruni, and the Lost Enlightenment. It only came out last year. It's a biography of two contemporaries of the period that I've discussed around the years 1000 to 1100. And I brought that book with me. I'm going to leave it for the CBEC library for anyone who wishes to examine his life in more detail. Now, finally, I want to bring it back to CBEC here by showing the commemorative medal issued by the UNESCO in 1980 to mark the 1000th birthday anniversary for Ibn Sina. A few years after that, they decided to give a prize, which they call the Avicenna Prize for Ethics and Science, awarded every 2 years to individuals and groups with outstanding achievements in ethics and science. Its purpose, of course, is to highlight the importance of ethics. The coin, the medal, shows a scene in which Avicenna, as it says, is surrounded by his disciples, and on the reverse is a quotation in Arabic and Latin saying, "Cooperate for the well-being of the body and the survival of the human species." I think it's obvious from my explanation of Ibn Sina's work on clinical experiments, at least, that he raised questions which we still focus on today in the area of medical research ethics. And I chose Ibn Sina as the subject of my comments not only because he represents such an important figure in the history of medicine, and someone who is certainly neglected in my country in medical study these days, but just as importantly because of his writings, because of his habits of thought, his choice of subject matter. He can be said to have foreshadowed of much of what we think of today as bioethics. Now let me explain how in 4 different ways Ibn Sina set patterns that we attempt to replicate today at studies at CBEC. First, he made use of the wisdom of the ancients to understand and explain how medicine should be practiced. The curriculum at CBEC similarly requires reading of materials from the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, along with Muslim scripture and scholarship, to probe contemporary questions of health and disease. Second, Ibn Sina was always, to use a word we use these days, relentlessly interdisciplinary. He was never constrained by the usual academic boundaries. And as such, no single perspective fills the course of study here at CBEC either. Students have to rely on work from history, from philosophy, from theology, all the medical sciences, in an attempt to appreciate the most fruitful way of understanding the roles of both doctors and patients. Third, consistent with that interdisciplinary view, students at CBEC step across the boundaries of the professions, examining both ancient and contemporary law, modern and traditional medicine. The background of students here have included those professional fields as well as the fields of higher education, the basic sciences, forensic science, and social work, just to name a few. And finally, Ibn Sina moved easily among the various regions where he lived, appreciating the cultures with which he had contact in interacting with people on their own terms. It is a hallmark of CBEC. It's built into its name that there is a cultural component to bioethics. It is not limited by the restrictions of one point of view or one country, but welcomes people of different country, of different languages, and of different traditions. And it regularly celebrates cultural expressions, including music, poetry, literature, and art. So it is appropriate, I think, that we revisit the life of Ibn Sina, who has been recognized internationally for the idea of ethics in science and medicine, as we celebrate these 2 decades of accomplishment here at CBEC. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So, I mean, when I was reading about
And also hearing your talk, is it, I mean, of course, clearly UNESCO seems to be celebrating it, but I feel that I'm not sure whether you're the right person to actually answer this question, but why is it in our educational systems that when we were growing up over here and learning, we never really learned about Ibn-e-Sina? It was, I mean, they were mentioned offhand, but we never really got an archival dip into the life and work of Ibn-e-Sina. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's even taught in medical schools, for example, or even for students of philosophy, some of which I did in my undergrad.
Yeah. Why? Well, that's a great question. I mean, that is the question of what is it we remember and what is it that we forget, and do we, are we intentional about that? It is a curiosity to me that I just happened to, find myself somewhere where this man had been born, and then remembered that, of course, I'd heard this name. And to be frank, this is a period of time which I've spent a lot of time studying in the European context. And yet, knowing that there was an extraordinary contribution from people who originally translated those texts, very little time was spent in my education certainly talking about that. And it explains things in ways, it explains things about language, it explains things about science, it explains to me things about history, which I'd, again, barely heard about, but, no one made any real focus on. So answering the question of why is it we remember what we remember, I think takes us back to the comment that Dr. Mozam made earlier in the day, is we have a tendency to remember the things that seem most important in our own cultures and forget everything else. And we have a tendency, as our speaker said yesterday in the keynote, to see the world, and I say we, I'm really talking about myself here, to see the world through the lens of colonialism that allowed the people who eventually colonized other places to imprint those places with a culture which was essentially foreign. And recovering the extraordinary wisdom and the beauty and all of the other things that happened that are invisible. Again, I have to thank my friends here for having me back and giving me the opportunity to get stuck in snowstorms so I could go visit places like Bukhara. I mean, I think along with my many adventures here in Pakistan, that stands as something that opened my eyes to things that again I've heard about, but I really knew very little about. So,
no.
Yes, Dr. Ali. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lombardo. I was just wondering, when you were using the word canon, it's actually in Arabic qanun, which is, the translation of it is law. So that probably changes the whole perception of when we say the qanun fi tibb means the law of medicine.
Yes.
And the second comment was about his age. He lived only 57 years. Do we know more how he died? Did he acquire some disease while researching?
The description that's given in at least two of the commentaries was an intestinal ailment. Not the sort of thing that I would find any specificity here in front of a group of gastroenterologists, but some kind of intestinal ailment. That's what they said. The first point you made, I think, is really important, and some of the commentaries that I looked at they focus on the fact that he called it the canon, the law, and they make something of this. They say, well, this is a really kind of an overstatement. He apparently was not the least bit shy, and not the least bit afraid of announcing his own brilliance. And so by picking that title, he certainly wanted to signal something. You're right. It is a peculiar title to use for a book of medicine. But on the other hand, he was also a lawyer.
Thank you.
Dr. Paul, the way Ibn-e-Sina wrote about medicine, as you just explained, that he also covered, apart from the organs and the body, the psyche, the psychological aspects, the aspects of character. You mentioned of love, ignorance, spiritual aspects. So, and we see that the Western universities were benefiting from his works as late as 17th century. So, where did all these aspects went away from the modern medicine? How did this happen? Because they were inspired from his text or the text of his contemporaries who were also taking medicine as a whole, covering the other aspects of human existence.
You know, if I'm following your question, I think for you, it is the peculiarity of the age that we live in that we do talk about specialties. I'm reminded when I was a student, I wrote a biography. My dissertation was a biography of a lawyer, and he'd only lived at that time. He had died maybe 30 years earlier, and people who knew him talked about him as someone who had memorized the entire law. I was living in Virginia at the time. The entire law of the state of Virginia sounded like a big deal. So I went to the library and I started looking at the law books, and it turns out that when he was born in the 1870s or something, the law of the state of Virginia, the statutes that had been passed, were only filled about 20 pages. So it was easier to be a generalist back then when there was so little special knowledge, and it was easier to cross boundaries and do it successfully. And so, why is it that we haven't been able to, one of the reasons I think that we haven't been able to replicate the kind of work that was done back then is because there's just so much more information. Today it is despairingly daunting to look at just to keep up with the literature in any one field, in any one subfield. And if you were foolish enough to try to do it in more than one, you spend most of your nights not sleeping. So it is about not being able to make connections because we don't know all of the details of other disciplines, but it's also about the fact that there's just so much more information. And that is, I think, the utility of programs like the one here, of trying to make the connections among those various subspecialties and trying to have people from them come and explain in language that those of us who are not specialists, can understand what those connections should look like.
Okay, hi, good morning. It's more of a wondering out aloud. Since after going through your presentation, it feels that Ibn-e-Sina had a very holistic approach to the mind, body, and did he talk about genders and the gender dysphorias and maybe, the problems at that particular time?
You're above my pay grade with that question because I don't know. I don't know. We do have someone who has read some of these, not in English but in Arabic here, and perhaps Dr. Nauman can address that at some point. I don't know whether he spoke about that.
Okay. The gender dysphoria, etc., I have not read stuff there, but if you look at the way it has emerged within medicine right now, and the social and the cultural reasons for it, I'm here again, I'm not coming from any references. These are entities and features that are in modern era. And this is because of what is there now socially and the shifts. So if you don't mind, Dr. Lombardo, so one of the things that we need to do is to understand, and to understand you have to put yourself in those years. What society was like, what were the things that concerned them that they wrote about. So issues of, for example, gender dysphoria, which is important for us now, is a product also of the society. So without having read Ibn-e-Sina at all, I would be surprised if things like that would appear in that. So, is it okay, Ms. Swaliha, because I had told them I want them to discuss.
Yeah.
Professor Paul, this is, I'm just having this feeling that he is ultimately left at the mercy of the translators by virtue of the language barrier that is actually persistent in this era even. What do you think if the documents that Ibn-e-Sina has written, if they are translated now at 2025, how will they be? And how sure we are that the translations that were done way back almost at 800 or 900 years ago, they were appropriate? I mean, there are areas that the things will remain like cloudy, and we may not be having the exact knowledge that this person was having. So is there something very new about these translations? Are they done recently or not? Or we are still relying on the ones that were done back 800 years ago?
No, again, I think, it's clear that there are scholars right now that are asking the same questions that you're asking, and you're asking a very fundamental question of how do we make sense of things that have been translated through a series of different languages over time, not just translated, but over time when those languages changed. And that is a job for philologists and scholars who study the language, as well as for the specialists to see whether or not the concepts of medicine and science, for example, that he was using are really reflective of what he was reading in Galen, for example. So, again, that's an ongoing issue. It's always a problem. How much do things change in translation? How much does language change in time? In my own country, there's a big debate, somewhat silly debate from my point of view, about whether or not we should freeze language in a certain period and say that's what it meant for all time. I find that silly because language changes every day as we use it. So you raise an important question, not certainly one that I could answer, but I can tell you that there are people who continue to probe the sources that he used as well as his own work.
Dr. Lombardo, I'm sorry, there's so many questions, but I will make a comment, and I've been told we need to move to the next one. The question you asked is an important question. The way I look at it is Ibn-e-Sina is, what we've seen is Ibn-e-Sina the physician. Within Muslim history, Ibn-e-Sina is, and this is a big debate, was he primarily a good, a physician versus a philosopher? And there is a lot of debate, and Ibn-e-Sina, in fact, his philosophical point of view, medicine and what he describes, this is more concrete. So iske andar jo interpretation, etc., perhaps it would not be that much of a problem. But Ibn-e-Sina, as a physician within Muslim history, the competition occurs where a lot of people feel that Fakhruddin al-Razi was actually the better physician, but he was also a philosopher. And Ibn-e-Sina, a lot of people believe, primarily he was a philosopher, but he was a good physician. So it's an interesting area to study. If you look at these two physicians and philosophers, Ibn-e-Sina, we don't have time to get into it, gets into a lot of trouble even with other Muslim philosophers for his interpretation of the soul or even the idea of God. So those are very interesting things to discuss, but thank you very much.